They called him just a mechanic, an old man with oil-stained hands who never left the ground, could have forgotten Hero Rise in the darkest storm. But that night, the storm came, a whiteout blizzard, a rescue team lost in the cold, and when everyone else was gone, he was the only one left. He didn't speak, he didn't argue, he just pulled out his old helmet, strapped it on, and climbed back into the cockpit, because sometimes the quietest person is the one with the greatest strength. Welcome to Graceful Valor Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The morning light barely touched the old hangar at Haven Ridge Air Rescue Station. Snow had already started to fall, thin white flakes catching in the cold wind that swept down from the mountains. Jack Coleman stood just inside the open doors, a mug of black coffee cupped in his rough, weathered hands. He watched as the young pilots milled about, checking their gear, sharing easy jokes that never included him. His presence was a constant in that place, but he knew how they saw him, a mechanic. Nothing more, just a man who fixed their rotors and tightened bolts, but who never once sat behind the stick. He wore the same old flannel shirt every day, the same worn boots, the same calm expression that never gave anything away. In the corner of the hangar, his tools were lined up like old friends, everything in its place. Jack had always believed that work done quietly was work done well, but in the eyes of the younger crew, he was just the wrench guy. They didn't know why he never climbed into the cockpit. They didn't know he had once been the man in that seat, the one who felt the weight of the sky every time the rotors lifted. And he never told them. Ava Turner, the youngest of the crew, watched him sometimes with a curious look. She didn't ask questions, but her eyes said she wanted to. Jack never encouraged it. He kept his head down and focused on the work, adjusting tension rods, checking fuel lines, making sure every machine was ready to fly. That was enough for him now. Still, every now and then, a conversation would drift close enough for him to hear. Why doesn't Jack fly? Someone would whisper. Did he ever? Another would shrug. He's just a mechanic, not a pilot, probably never even had the guts. Jack never answered. He just wiped his hands on a rag and went back to the next engine. But the truth was something he carried like an old scar. Years ago, long before Haven Ridge, long before the quiet days in the hangar, Jack had been a pilot, a good one, the kind they trusted in. The worst of it, he could still feel the weight of the helmet on his head, the cold bite of altitude through the cracked canopy. He remembered every detail. There had been a mission, one last flight in a place where the mountains met the sky in jagged lines. He was the lead, the one responsible for getting his crew in and out. They flew low through canyons that swallowed the sound of their rotors, radio chatter tense and clipped. Jack still heard those voices sometimes when he closed his eyes. It had been going well until it wasn't. The ambush was sudden, sharp bullets sparked against the fuselage and the chopper shuddered under the impact. Jack fought for control, calling out positions, trying to keep the bird in the air, but in the end, it was all falling apart. He felt the tail rotor fail, heard the scream of metal twisting as the helicopter spun. He managed to land it barely in a narrow clearing. The rest of his crew, they didn't make it. Jack was the only one who walked away from that wreckage, the only one to crawl out of the twisted door and stand on shaking legs. He never forgot the smell of fuel in the snow, the silence after the last radio call cut out. That silence had stayed with him ever since. When he finally came home, he packed up the medals they gave him. He didn't want them, he didn't want reminders. He found work as a mechanic, the only way he could still be near the birds without having to fly them. He told himself it was enough, that he'd done his part, but deep down, he knew it was fear that kept him grounded. Jack never spoke of that mission. He never told them about the last flight or the weight he carried. The other pilots didn't need to know, and he didn't want to see the pity in their eyes, so he let them think he was just the wrench guy, let them believe he had never been anything more. The engines were easier to understand. They didn't care about medals or ghosts. They just needed the right bolt, the right pressure, the right pair of hands to keep them alive. Jack could do that. He could give them that. As the wind howled outside the hangar doors, he moved from one chopper to the next, checking for leaks, feeling each vibration like a pulse beneath his fingertips. He had a way of listening that didn't need words. That was what kept him steady. Ethan Blake, the team leader, stopped by sometimes to ask how a repair was going. He was younger, full of the kind of confidence Jack used to wear like a second skin. You sure this one's good, Jack? He'd ask. Voice half teasing, half serious. Jack would just nod. She'll fly, he'd say, and she always did. But even as he spoke, Jack felt the weight in his chest. The memories he kept locked tight threatened to rise on days like this, when the sky outside looked like the day he lost everything. He would grip the wrench a little harder, let the cold air wash over his face, and remind himself that was then, this is now. Inside the hangar, the other pilots joked and swapped stories. Jack listened with half an ear as he worked, letting their laughter fill the quiet spaces of his mind. He didn't begrudge them that. He remembered what it was like to be young and fearless, but he also knew that fear had its place, that sometimes it was the only thing that kept a man alive. As the snow began to fall heavier outside, Jack took a moment to stand in the doorway. The wind cutting across his face, he breathed it in the cold and the silence. It felt almost like penance, standing there alone while the world moved on around him. Back inside, he wiped his hands clean, moving slowly, deliberately. The radio crackled with weather updates, and he could feel the tension building in the air. Another storm was coming, he could sense it in his bones. The same way he used to read the sky from the cockpit. Jack set down his coffee cup and picked up his wrench again. No one noticed, no one saw the way his hands lingered on the metal, the way he paused before each turn of the bolt, but that was all right, he didn't need them to. See, he knew who he was, and for now, that was enough. Could a single flight redeem a lifetime of silence? The snow fell harder that night, thick flakes swirling around the hangar lights like a curtain of white. Jack Coleman stood in the doorway, shoulders squared against the cold as he watched the last of the rescue team lift off. Ethan Blake was at the stick, his voice calm over the radio. Even as the storm built around them, Jack stayed long after the chopper vanished into the dark sky. He felt the cold settle into his bones, a silent reminder of everything he'd tried to leave behind. Inside the hangar was quiet, the hum of equipment a low, steady rhythm that steadied his hands even as his mind started to drift. Ava Turner came by, her cheeks red from the cold, eyes bright with nervous energy. "Storm's going to be bad," she said, almost like a question. Jack just nodded, not trusting his voice to answer. He could feel it already, the way the wind clawed at the doors, the way the snow seemed to swallow every sound. Hours passed like that, Jack moving from machine to machine, double-checking what he could, while outside, the world turned to white. He found himself glancing at the radio more than once, listening for updates that never came. The team was out there somewhere beyond the mountains, and he knew better than anyone what that meant. Then just before midnight, the radio crackled to life, a burst of static, then Ethan's voice, tight and controlled, but with an edge Jack recognized all too well. "This is Eagle 3, we're grounded. Visibility 0, requesting immediate evac support." Ava's face went pale as she leaned in close. Jack didn't move, he stared at the radio, his mind already painting the scene. Rotor blades iced over, altimeter spinning blind, the cold pressing in from every side. He knew that feeling, knew it better than he wanted to. The dispatcher's voice came through, calm and measured. "Copy that. Eagle 3, sit tight, we're coordinating support." But everyone knew the truth. There was no one else, the other pilots were already out, scattered by the storm. Jack was the only one left. He felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. Heavy and cold. Ava turned to him, her lips parted like she was about to say something, but Jack just looked at the snow outside, at the swirling dark that seemed to close in tighter with every breath. The memory of that last flight came back in a rush, the whine of the engine failing, the sudden jolt as the bird went down, the voices of his crew in his headset fading one by one. He had tried to bury it, to lock it away with the metals he'd refused to keep, but now it rose up again, as real as the snow outside. His hands clenched around the wrench at his side, he could feel his pulse in his throat, his breath catching in the cold air of the hangar. He told himself it wasn't his fight anymore, that he'd done enough, but even as he thought it, he knew it wasn't true. Ava's voice broke through the silence, small and uncertain. "Jack, you're the only one here who can fly." She didn't say it like an order, she said it like a plea, and that was what made it so hard to ignore. He looked at her, then really looked at her, the worry in her eyes, the way she hugged her arms to her chest to keep from shaking. She was young, but she understood what was at stake. Jack swallowed hard, the words he wanted to say stuck behind his teeth. For a moment, he let the silence stretch, let the storm outside fill the hangar with its cold, relentless breath. In his mind, he saw the clearing in the mountains again, the wreckage still smoking, the snow stained red. He saw the faces of the men he'd left behind, and the guilt that had kept him grounded for so many years. The radio crackled again, another burst of static. "Eagle 3 to base, we're losing heat." "Repeat, we're losing heat." Ethan's voice was tight, strained. Jack closed his eyes, he knew what that meant, knew it in the way a man knows when the ice starts to crack beneath his feet. When he opened his eyes, he saw Ava watching him, her breath held like she was afraid to even blink. Jack drew in a slow breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle into his bones. He set the wrench down carefully, his hands steady even as his heart raced. He moved to the locker in the corner, the one he hadn't touched in years. The flight suit was still there, the name patch faded, but the weight of it heavy in his hands. He ran his fingers over the fabric, feeling the memory of every flight, every mission, every loss stitched into the seams. Ava took a step forward, her voice a whisper. "Are you sure?" Jack didn't answer, he just nodded once, the kind of nod that said everything he couldn't find the words for. He pulled the suit on slowly, the motions automatic, muscle memory taking over where courage faltered. The hangar felt smaller as he stepped out into the snow, the wind cut at his face, but he didn't flinch. He walked with purpose, every step a quiet defiance of the fear that still lived in the back of his mind. Ava followed close behind, her breath a white cloud in the freezing air. "We'll get you prepped," she said, voice shaking. But sure. Jack didn't look at her, he focused on the helicopter, Eagle 4. The one he'd kept ready even when no one else thought they'd need it. He climbed up to the cockpit, every motion deliberate, every movement a quiet promise. The seat felt familiar, the controls like old friends he hadn't seen in years. He took a moment to breathe, to steady the shaking in his chest. The radio hissed softly as he keyed the mic. "This is Eagle 4, he said, his voice low and even. "I'm lifting off." In the silence that followed, he felt something settle inside him, the quiet acceptance of a man who knew the only way forward was through. The rotors spun up slowly, the deep thrum of the engine filling the night. Ava watched from the ground, her eyes wide, her hands clenched at her sides. Jack didn't look back, he didn't need to. He knew what he was doing, knew why he was doing it. As the chopper lifted into the swirling dark, the fear didn't vanish, it never would, but he felt something else rise to meet it, something stronger, a memory of the men he'd lost, of the promise he'd made to himself all those years ago, to never leave anyone behind. The snow swallowed the helicopter as it rose, the storm closing in around it, but inside the cockpit, Jack's hands were steady, his eyes were clear, and for the first time in years he felt the weight of the sky, not as a burden, but as a call he could no longer ignore. The helicopter shuddered as Jack Coleman lifted it into the storm. The snow hit the windshield like frozen knives, and the wind howled in the dark like a thing alive, but he held the controls steady, his eyes locked on the flickering instruments in front of him. In the back of his mind, he felt the old memories stirring, the echo of that night so long ago, the voices of his crew, the whine of failing engines, the scream of metal as the bird went down. Jack clenched his jaw, refusing to let it drag him under. He kept his focus on the mission, not the ghost that had haunted him for so many years. The rescue team was out there, and he was their only chance. He let the truth anchor him as the helicopter climbed, the rotors fighting the icy air below. The world had vanished into White Pine Creek was just a memory swallowed by the blizzard that raged across the mountains. Jack scanned the instruments, trusting them even when the world outside turned into nothing but swirling snow. He thought of the men he'd lost, their names etched into his memory like scars. He heard their laughter, their voices calling out in the headset, fragments of a past he tried to bury, but he wouldn't let that fear decide for him now. Jack reached up, adjusting the defroster vents to keep the windshield clear. His hands moved with a quiet certainty, every motion smooth, deliberate. The flight suit felt heavy on his shoulders, but it was a weight he welcomed. It reminded him of what he was here to do. The radio crackled to life, a thin thread of sound in the howling dark. Eagle 3, do you copy? Jack's voice was calm, a steady presence in the chaos. There was a pause, then Ethan's voice, ragged with relief. Eagle 4, Jack, is that you? It's me, Jack said, his tone firm. Hang tight, I'm coming for you. He didn't need to say more, the promise was enough, a promise to bring them home no matter what. As he flew deeper into the mountains, the wind slammed against the fuselage, rattling the chopper like a toy in a giant's fist. Jack tightened his grip on the cyclic, leaning into each gust with a quiet resolve. He'd spent years telling himself he was done with the sky, but in that moment, he felt more alive than he had in a long, long time. The memories came in flashes, the last flight, the crash, the bitter cold of the snow as he crawled from the wreckage. He let them come, but he didn't let them take over. He was here now, and this time he wouldn't let anyone be left behind. The chopper's skids rocked as he crested a ridge, the snow whipping across the windshield in angry sheets. Jack steadied his breath, his focus narrowing to the instruments and the faint glow of the radio beacon from the down team. Visibility is almost zero, he muttered to himself, adjusting the collective just enough to keep the bird level. His voice was low, calm, the voice of a man who'd stopped running from his own memories. Ethan's voice came over the radio again, choppy, but clear. Jack, we're at the edge of a clearing, we've got wounded, hypothermia setting in. Jack nodded, though no one could see. I'll find you, he said softly, and in that quiet promise, the fear inside him seemed to ease. He banked left, following the flicker of the beacon as it cut through the static. The helicopter's frame creaked under the strain, but he knew every sound, every shudder. He'd spent years tending to these machines, he trusted them like old friends. As the clearing came into view, Jack felt his pulse steady, his mind sharpening. The trees below were black shapes against the snow, the ground a blur of white and shadow. He could see the glint of metal where the other chopper had gone down, a battered shape half buried in the drift. He set his jaw, scanning for a place to put down. The wind fought him, but he rode it like a wave, adjusting pitch and angle until the skids met the snow with a jolt that rattled his teeth. But the chopper held, they were down. He kept the rotors spinning, the blades a blur of motion above the whiteout world. Ava's voice came through the headset, tight with worry. Jack, status. He drew in a breath. On the ground, he said, going in. He unbuckled, every motion deliberate. The cold slammed into him as he stepped out, but he didn't flinch. He moved through the snow, the wind howling around him, his breath steaming in the icy air. The down chopper was a twisted shape in the drift, but he could see movement, figures huddled in the shelter of the wreck. Jack's boots crunched through the snow, each step a quiet defiance of the past that still haunted him. Ethan, he called out, his voice carrying in the storm. A figure emerged, bundled in a rescue jacket, his face pale with cold. Jack, Ethan said, relief in his eyes. We didn't think anyone would make it. Jack just nodded, his expression steady. Let's get your people out. They worked quickly, moving with the urgency of men who understood what was at stake. Jack helped load the injured into the chopper, his hands sure and steady even when the wind threatened to knock him down. Each face he saw, each shiver of cold and fear only hardened his resolve. The last of the team was aboard when Ethan turned to him, his breath ragged. You're sure about this, Jack? He asked. His voice low. Jack looked at him, his eyes clear. I'm sure, he said, this ends with all of us going home. They climbed back in, the warmth of the cockpit a shock after the bitter cold outside. Jack settled into the pilot seat, his fingers wrapping around the controls with a quiet familiarity. He could feel the weight of the mission, but he didn't let it shake him. The rotors roared as he lifted off, the chopper clawing its way into the storm. The wind fought him every inch of the way, but Jack flew with the calm of a man who had made peace with the sky. Every movement was deliberate, every adjustment precise. In the headset, he could hear the ragged breathing of the men he carried, their lives in his hands. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. The drone of the engine was the only voice he trusted. The flight back was a blur of white and shadow, the world outside lost to the fury of the storm. Jack kept his focus locked on the instruments, on the memory of what he was fighting for the first time in years. He felt the past and the present merge, not in fear, but in purpose. He flew through the night, the storm a living thing around him, and as the lights of Haven Ridge finally broke through the dark, he felt something lift inside him, a weight he'd carried for too long, finally easing in the cold air. He had faced the storm, and he had not turned away. The lights of Haven Ridge Air Rescue Station cut through the storm like a beacon, drawing Jack Coleman and his battered helicopter home. The skids touched down with a jolt, the chopper settling into the snowslick pad with a quiet finality. Jack's hands didn't shake as he powered down the engines, the rotors slowing in the icy night air. For a long moment, he just sat there, listening to the fading whine of the blades. The cabin was quiet but alive, the soft breaths of the men he'd brought home, the weight of the storm still lingering in the air. Jack closed his eyes and let out a breath he'd been holding since he first lifted off. Ava Turner was the first to reach the chopper, her boots crunching across the snow as she swung the door open. Her eyes met Jack's, wide with something like "Odd you did it," she said softly, her voice catching in the cold. Jack just gave her a small nod, his face calm, but his eyes bright. Ethan Blake climbed out next, leaning heavily on Jack's shoulder as he steadied himself. "Couldn't have done it without you, Jack," he said, his voice rough but strong. Jack looked at him for a moment, then just squeezed his shoulder and replied. Words didn't seem to matter right then. The medics moved in quickly, pulling the injured from the cabin with practiced hands. Jack watched them work, the red lights of their headlamps glowing in the swirling snow. The men he'd brought back would be all right. That was enough, that was all he needed. He climbed down from the cockpit, his boots slipping slightly on the ice, the cold bit at his face, but he didn't feel it. He walked across the pad, the storm still howling around him, but it felt different now, not like a threat, but like a challenge he'd already answered. Inside the hangar, the others waited, the mechanics, the dispatchers, even the cooks who kept the coffee hot when the nights ran long. They watched him walk in, their faces open, unguarded. There was no laughter this time, no careless jokes, just a quiet respect that settled over the room like a warm blanket. Ava stepped up beside him, her breath clouding in the cold. "I didn't know you still had it in you," she said with a smile that was half apology, half pride. Jack let out a quiet breath, his own smile small but real. "Neither did I," he said softly, and somehow that truth felt like enough. Ethan walked over, his face flushed from the cold, a fresh bandage on his forehead. "You saved us all tonight," he said, his voice low but steady. Jack shook his head. "Just did what had to be done," he replied, his tone even. He didn't need the praise, he didn't need the applause, the flight itself had been enough. Word spread fast through the station, and by dawn, the whole town of Pine Creek seemed to know. Messages came in over the radio from fire crews, from other rescue stations, from families who had waited through the night for news. They all said the same thing: "Thank you." But Jack didn't linger to soak it in. He moved through the hangar quietly, checking each machine as he always did, his hands steady, his eyes clear. The work was what grounded him, what reminded him who he was, and for the first time in years, he felt like that was more than enough. Later that morning, the sun broke through the clouds, turning the snow into a blanket of light. Jack stood outside for a moment, his breath fogging in the cold. He looked up at the sky, at the pale blue that had been hidden all night, and felt something inside him settle. He thought about that last flight, the one that had haunted him for so long. He thought about the men he'd lost, their voices still echoing in the quiet corners of his mind. But today, those memories didn't feel like chains, they felt like wings, a reminder of who he'd been and who he still was. Ava found him there, a mug of hot coffee in her hands. "You're a quiet hero, Jack," she said softly, handing him the cup. He took it with a small smile, his fingers warming against the ceramic. "I'm just a mechanic," he said, but they both knew that wasn't true. She looked at him for a long moment, then just nodded. "Well," she said with a quiet smile, "sometimes mechanics save the world." Jack let out a quiet laugh, the sound small but sure. "Sometimes," he agreed. As the day wore on, the station buzzed back to life, engines rumbling, radios crackling, the steady rhythm of people who understood that every day might ask for more than you thought you could give. Jack moved among them, not as the man they'd once dismissed, but as the one they turned to without question. He didn't ask for thanks, he didn't need them, the respect in their eyes was enough, the way they stepped aside for him now, the way they listened when he spoke. It was a quiet thing, but it was real, and Jack had learned that sometimes quiet things were the strongest of all. That night, long after the hangar lights dimmed and the world outside had gone still, Jack sat alone in the cockpit of Eagle 4, the engine was off, the rotors silent, but he sat there anyway, his hands resting lightly on the controls. He let the silence fill the space around him, let it settle into the corners of his heart. He thought about what came next. Maybe he'd fly again, maybe he'd keep his feet on the ground, but for the first time in years, the choice felt like his to make, and that was enough. He took a slow breath, the cold night air filling his lungs. In the darkness, he could still hear the echoes of the storm, but they didn't scare him anymore. He had faced them, and he had won. As he stepped down from the chopper, he paused for a moment, his hand on the cold metal of the fuselage. A small smile touched his lips, and he whispered softly to himself, "Still worthy." The words felt like a promise, quiet and sure. Outside, the snow fell in soft, silent drifts, the world hushed and bright under the winter moon. Jack walked away from the helicopter, his footsteps sure, his heart. He knew there would be more storms ahead, but he also knew he was ready, and in that simple truth, Jack Coleman found something he'd thought he'd lost forever, not the roar of the engines or the weight of the sky, but the quiet courage to keep moving forward, no matter how fierce the storm. And this time, he wasn't afraid to fly again. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition, some just need to know that today someone isn't going hungry, and sometimes that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Graceful Valor Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.